The ship had been at sea for weeks. Its captain, John White, governor of the English colony on Roanoke Island, stood at the bow and stared at the shoreline. He had not seen this place in 3 years. 3 years he had spent trying to return. 3 years of war, storms, and bureaucratic delay keeping him from the people he had left behind. He had left behind 115 men, women, and children. His own daughter was among them. His granddaughter, Virginia Dare, the first English child born in the Americas, would now be 3 years old. White described what happened next in his own journal, a document that survives to this day. They called out. No one answered. They found the settlement. The houses were standing, but overgrown with vines, as if no one had touched them in months. Chests had been ransacked. Books lay on the ground, pages rotted from the rain. Personal belongings, White's own maps, his paintings, his armor, had been damaged and scattered. But there were no bodies, no graves, no sign of violence, no burned buildings, no weapons left behind. The colony had not been destroyed. It had simply ceased to exist. Croatoan. That was all. 1 word. 5 letters. No explanation. And for more than 4 centuries, it has remained one of the most debated inscriptions in the history of the Western world. To understand what happened on Roanoke Island, you first have to understand what England was trying to accomplish, and how desperate that mission had become. By the mid-1580s, Spain dominated the Americas. Spanish silver was flowing across the Atlantic. Spanish colonies stretched from Florida to Peru. England had nothing. Sir Walter Raleigh, a favorite of Queen Elizabeth I, was determined to change that. In 1584, Raleigh sent an exploratory expedition to the coast of present-day North Carolina. The reports that came back were extraordinary. Fertile land. Abundant wildlife. Indigenous peoples described as welcoming. The region was named Virginia in honor of the Queen. 2 years later, in 1585, the first English colonists arrived on Roanoke Island. It was a military expedition, 108 men, no women, no families. Their mission: establish a foothold. Map the coast. Assess the resources. It failed. Relations with local tribes deteriorated. Food ran out. The men grew desperate. When Sir Francis Drake passed by in 1586, returning from a raid on Spanish settlements, the colonists abandoned the island and sailed home with him. But Raleigh was not finished. In 1587, he organized a second attempt, this time with a different vision. Not a military outpost, but a permanent settlement. Families. Women. Children. People who had come to stay. Among them, a young woman named Eleanor White, daughter of the appointed governor, John White. Eleanor was pregnant. On July 22, 1587, 117 men, women, and children set foot on Roanoke Island. On August 18, 1587, less than a month after arriving, Eleanor gave birth to a daughter. They named her Virginia Dare. She was the first English child born in the New World. The colony was alive. It had a future. But it had a problem. By late August 1587, the colonists were in trouble. They had arrived on Roanoke Island expecting supplies and support from an established infrastructure. Instead, they found themselves starting almost from scratch. Food was limited. The relationship with neighboring tribes, complicated already by the failures of 1585, was tense. Their supplies would not last the winter. A decision was made. Someone had to sail back to England and return with provisions. John White, the governor, did not want to go. He was responsible for the colony. His daughter had just given birth. Leaving felt like abandonment. According to his own account, the colonists insisted. They asked him to go. They believed he was the most qualified to secure supplies and navigate the political relationships back in England. On August 27, 1587, White boarded a ship and sailed east. He promised to return as soon as possible. What White could not have anticipated was the catastrophe waiting for him in Europe. In 1588, the Spanish Armada, the most powerful naval fleet in the world, launched an invasion of England. Every available English ship was pressed into service. Queen Elizabeth issued an order: no vessel could leave English waters without royal permission. White was trapped. He managed one brief, failed attempt to return in 1588. His ships were turned back by a combination of bad weather and pirates. He wrote letters. He petitioned officials. He appealed to Raleigh. Nothing worked. By the time he finally secured passage back to Roanoke, 3 years had passed. 3 years in which no ship had reached the colony. 3 years in which 115 people had been entirely alone. What he found, or rather, what he didn't find, would haunt him for the rest of his life. John White had, before his departure in 1587, agreed on a signal with the colonists. If they were forced to abandon Roanoke, if they moved to another location, they would carve the name of their destination into a tree or post. If they left under distress, they would add a cross above the word. When White found the word Croatoan carved into a post at the colony's entrance, there was no cross. According to his journal, he took this as a sign of hope. The colonists, he believed, had gone willingly, and they had gone to Croatoan Island, roughly 50 miles to the south, where a tribe known as the Croatoan people lived. White and the English had maintained a relatively peaceful relationship with the Croatoan, and at least one colonist, a man named Manteo, had close ties to the tribe. The sign was not a farewell. It was an address. But White never made it to Croatoan. A storm forced his ships to sea. His crew, exhausted, frustrated, and increasingly unwilling to risk their lives for a colony they had never cared about, refused to search further. When the weather cleared, the decision was made to return to England. White never went back. He spent his remaining years in Ireland, writing and painting. In his letters, he described the colonists as those he had committed to the mercy of God. He died, some records suggest, sometime around 1593, without ever learning what happened to the 115 people he had left behind, including his daughter and his granddaughter. The word on the post was the last direct evidence anyone ever found. But that single word, Croatoan, would set off more than 4 centuries of argument, investigation, and speculation. In the days following his arrival, John White conducted what his journal describes as a thorough search of the island. What he found was deeply strange, not because of what was there, but because of what was missing. The houses were standing. This was significant. A massacre would likely have involved fire. An epidemic would have left bodies. A sudden evacuation under attack would have left traces, weapons, blood, the detritus of violence. Instead, overgrown structures, scattered belongings, ransacked chests, White believed by local tribes in the colonists' absence, not by violence. His own possessions, left behind when he sailed for England, were damaged by rain and neglect. His maps were rotten and spoiled. His books were torn from the covers. His armor was rusted. None of this suggested a sudden disaster. It suggested the slow passage of time, the slow, quiet decay of abandoned things. White noted one further detail in his journal, a detail that historians have returned to repeatedly. Near the site, he found what he described as the remains of a structure, possibly a small fort or defensive perimeter that the colonists had partially dismantled. The timbers had been moved. Someone had taken the wood, not burned it, not left it to rot. Taken it. That kind of careful, deliberate salvage does not speak of panic. It speaks of preparation. Of people who knew they were leaving, and took what they needed for a journey. But where did they go? And why did no ship, no expedition, no explorer encounter 115 missing English colonists in the years that followed? The answer, if there is one, begins 50 miles south of Roanoke Island. The Croatoan were not strangers to the English. Historical records document multiple interactions between English explorers and the Croatoan tribe during the 1580s. Unlike several other local tribes, who had reason to distrust the colonists after violent incidents in 1585, the Croatoan maintained a notably cooperative relationship with the English. A man named Manteo, identified in surviving records as a member of the Croatoan people, had traveled to England twice. He served as a translator and intermediary. On August 13, 1587, just days before John White's departure, Manteo was formally inducted into English allegiance and given the title Lord of Roanoke, a gesture meant to formalize the alliance. He was the first indigenous person to receive such a title from the English crown. This matters, because if the Roanoke colonists were going to seek refuge with any neighboring tribe, if they were going to abandon their island settlement and ask for protection, the Croatoan were the most logical choice. The Croatoan lived on a large barrier island to the south. They had food, shelter, and knowledge of the land. They had no reason to harm the colonists. Some historians believe what happened next was not a disappearance at all, but an integration. A slow merging of two peoples, forced together by necessity, until the English colonists were no longer identifiably English. Local accounts from later centuries describe a tribe, the Lumbee people of present-day North Carolina, that held traditions of English ancestry. Some spoke of ancestors with gray eyes, or skin lighter than their neighbors. Some bore surnames that, according to oral tradition, echoed those of the Roanoke colonists. The exact cause of these traditions remains unknown, but they were documented, and they were specific. And they were not the only clue. For more than 4 centuries, historians, archaeologists, anthropologists, and amateur investigators have proposed explanations for the fate of the Roanoke colonists. Each theory accounts for some of the evidence. None accounts for all of it. The assimilation theory, the most widely accepted among contemporary historians. The colonists, unable to survive alone, sought refuge with the Croatoan, and over time, integrated into the tribe. Children intermarried. Languages mixed. Within a generation, the English colonists had ceased to exist as a distinct group. This theory is supported by the carved word, the lack of violence, the known alliance with the Croatoan, and the later oral traditions of the Lumbee people. It is undermined by the absence of any contemporary English account of encountering colonists, or their descendants, in the decades that followed. The Spanish massacre theory. Spain considered the Roanoke settlement an act of aggression on territory it claimed. Historical records confirm that Spanish intelligence had located Roanoke by 1588. Some historians believe Spanish forces destroyed the colony before White could return. The evidence: Spanish documents reference a settlement of English on the coast of present-day North Carolina. The evidence against: no Spanish record claims credit for destroying Roanoke, and such a victory would almost certainly have been documented. The starvation and dispersal theory. Cut off from England during the Armada crisis, the colonists may have run out of food and scattered inland, seeking survival in smaller groups. Some may have survived for years in indigenous communities. Others may not have survived at all. The evidence: the salvaged timber, suggesting a planned departure. The lack of mass graves, suggesting no single catastrophe. The evidence against: 115 people dispersing in multiple directions would almost certainly have produced some surviving record, some account from an indigenous community, some European sighting. The inland migration theory. Some researchers have proposed that a faction of the colonists moved inland, possibly up the Chowan or Roanoke rivers, seeking fertile land away from the coast. Artifacts of European origin found far inland, including iron objects consistent with late 16th century English manufacture, have been cited as support. The evidence is suggestive. The conclusions remain contested. Each theory is plausible. Each is incomplete. But in 2012, a discovery was made, not in the ground, but on a piece of paper that had been sitting in a British museum for over 4 centuries. In 2012, researchers from the First Colony Foundation, a non-profit organization dedicated to the archaeology of early English settlement in North America, made an announcement that shocked the historical community. They had been studying one of John White's original maps of the Carolina coast, held in the collection of the British Museum. The map was remarkable in its own right, a detailed, accurate rendering of the coastline, rivers, and indigenous settlements, drawn by White during his time in the Americas. But hidden beneath a patch, a small piece of paper glued over part of the map, was something no one had noticed. When researchers used modern imaging techniques to look beneath the patch, they found a symbol. A small mark, drawn in ink. A fort. Four-sided. Deliberately concealed. The location, roughly 50 miles inland from Roanoke Island, at the junction of two rivers. Historical records suggest this was not accidental. Someone, most likely White himself or Raleigh, had intentionally obscured this location. Why? One possibility: it marked a planned inland retreat site, known only to the governor and his patrons, kept secret to prevent Spanish interception. If so, it may be the closest thing to a forwarding address the colonists ever left. The first colony foundation began archaeological excavations near the corresponding modern location, a site in Bertie County, North Carolina, known as Site X. What they found was extraordinary. European artifacts dating to the late 16th century. Fragments of ceramic tile consistent with English manufacture of the period. Evidence of a structure. Evidence, in short, that someone had been there. Whether those someones were Roanoke colonists remains, as of the most recent published research, unconfirmed. But the ground, it seems, has not finished speaking. The known evidence for the fate of the Roanoke colonists is frustratingly thin. But within that evidence, several details have resisted every attempt at a clean explanation. The iron objects, multiple pieces of iron, including a fireplace tool and metal bars consistent with late 16th century English manufacture, have been found at inland sites in North Carolina, far from the coast. Indigenous peoples of the region did not commonly work iron. European traders did not reach these areas until decades after Roanoke. The origin of these objects remains debated. The Lumbee oral tradition. The Lumbee people, a tribe indigenous to the Robeson County area of North Carolina, have maintained for centuries an oral tradition of partial European ancestry. Their ancestral surnames, documented by researchers in the 18th and 19th centuries, include names found on the Roanoke colonist list: Dare, Cooper, Sampson, Jones. This correlation has been noted, debated, and studied. DNA analysis of Lumbee ancestry has produced suggestive but inconclusive results. The exact connection, if any, between the Lumbee and the Roanoke colonists remains one of the most contested questions in colonial American history. The face descriptions: English explorer John Lawson, traveling through North Carolina in 1701, recorded an encounter with a tribe he called the Hatteras Indians, living on what is now Hatteras Island, close to the original Croatoan territory. Some members of the tribe, Lawson wrote, claimed descent from white people. Several, he noted, had gray eyes. It is impossible to verify Lawson's account or the claims he described. But his notes, published in 1709, represent one of the earliest documented suggestions that something of the Roanoke colonists survived, absorbed into the population of the Carolina coast. Virginia Dare. Of all the missing colonists, the fate of Virginia Dare, the first English child born in the Americas, has attracted the most attention and the most speculation. She was 3 years old when her grandfather sailed away. She was 116 years old would have been, when anyone looked for her seriously again. She left no confirmed trace. Some historians believe she died young, either from disease or in whatever crisis befell the colony. Others believe she survived long enough to grow up within an indigenous community, her English identity becoming, over time, a memory. The truth, if it exists, has not yet been found. John White died, most records suggest, in Ireland sometime in the early 1590s. He was an artist as well as a governor. His watercolor paintings of the peoples and landscapes of coastal Carolina remain among the most important visual records of indigenous North America from the 16th century. He never found the colony. He never found his daughter. He never found Virginia Dare. In his final surviving letter, written in 1593 to the explorer and geographer Richard Hakluyt, White expressed something that reads less like resolution than exhaustion. He had done what he could, he wrote. The rest was in God's hands. The Roanoke story is not simply a mystery of 115 missing people. It is a story about the cost of empire, about what it means to use human lives as instruments of national ambition, and then to lose track of them when something more urgent comes along. The Spanish Armada was more important than 115 colonists. War was more important. Navigation rights were more important. And so the colony waited. And waited. and became, in the silence, something no one had expected. Gone. Over the past 4 decades, archaeology has slowly begun to fill the silence. Site X in Bertie County. The hidden symbol on White's map. DNA studies of the Lumbee people. Analysis of 16th-century artifacts found deep in the Carolina interior. None of it has produced a definitive answer. Some historians believe the colonists integrated with the Croatoan and survived. Some believe they dispersed, merged with multiple tribes, and dissolved into the continent. Some believe a small faction traveled inland and built a life that has simply never been found. The exact fate of the Roanoke colonists remains, after 435 years, officially unknown. But perhaps the deepest mystery is not what happened, but why it took so long for anyone to look. 115 people vanished. They were English subjects. They had names. They had children. Virginia Dare had a name. And yet, for centuries, the prevailing response was not investigation, but legend. Not excavation, but story. We invented folklore around the emptiness, rather than looking too hard at what the emptiness meant.